So thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited. Well, first of all, my name is Deborah James, and I'm the director of the International Program at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Since we are late, I'm just going to skip a little bit of the introduction. I think many of you are familiar with CEPR. As you know, Ecuador recently became the first country to undertake a comprehensive audit of its debt, and the Commission for the Comprehensive Audit of the Foreign Debt, as it is called in English, recently published the results of its investigation, and the government is now considering various policy options based on the information revealed in the study. Today we are very honored to have the Minister of Economy and Finance of Ecuador, Maria Elsa Viteri, who will discuss the implications of the Ecuadorian debt situation in the context of the global financial crisis, including the negative impacts of deregulation in the financial markets and the lack of appropriate established international mechanisms for auditing developing country debt. The economist Maria Elsa Viteri received her degree from the Universidad Católica de Santiago de Guayaquil, where she was later the Director of Economic Research, and after that the Principal Professor of Economics, among other positions. She also served as the Director of Finance for various institutions in the private sector. She returned to public service and has worked at the Ministry of Economy and Finance since January 2007, recently becoming the Minister this past September. We'll also be pleased to have some comments by Neal Watkins, the Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network, the U.S. arm of the Global Jubilee Debt Cancellation Campaign. And as many of you are familiar with the campaign, I will just note that they have actually been successful in winning over $80 billion in debt cancellation for poor countries. We will also have comments from Mark Weisbrot, the co-director of CEPR, and as you know, CEPR has been active on issues of the IMF and debt for a very long time, and has been raising alarm about the impact of the U.S. financial crisis on developing countries, including contrasting the U.S. bailouts and fiscal stimulus with the procyclical policies mandated by the IMF, which have stifled economic growth and led to further indebtedness in countries like Ecuador. So without further ado, we would love to present to you economist Maria Elsa Viteri, Minister of Economy and Finance of Ecuador.
Bueno, no sé si me escuchan, no.
I do.
Ahora sí. Bueno, muy buenos días. Lamento que la reunión tenga que ser muy rápida. La verdad es que la agenda se me complicó bastante, ¿no? Traía una presentación que es una recopilación de varias presentaciones que durante este tiempo hemos hecho, y fundamentalmente creo que la parte más interesante estará al final. Voy a pasar muy rápidamente. Ya, ok.
Okay. So, in addition to running a little bit late, our translator canceled this morning, so we're going to do a consecutive as opposed to our normal simultaneous. That's why you're not seeing the headphones. So she's very glad to be here, and just said that obviously the presentation is going to be a little short since we're a little hurried this morning, and the most interesting part probably is at the end, and we'll just be alternating here with the microphone, so please be patient. Thank you.
Vamos entonces. Lo primero que yo quiero hacer hincapié es la decisión presidencial. Nuestra única deuda es con el pueblo. Realmente nuestra posición es como demanda del pueblo y para contestarle al pueblo.
So the first place to start is actually with the presidential decision, and the presidential decision says our only debt is with the people, and it's really important that this has been a demand of people for many years, and our job is to really give a response to that demand.
Se conformó con el decreto del 9 de julio del año 2007, lo que pasó a ser la primera auditoría de la deuda interna, yo diría que en el mundo, promocionada por un gobierno.
So this decree was given on the 9th of July of 2007, and it was a decree to do what I think is the very first comprehensive audit of foreign debt undertaken by a government of any country in the world.
Los objetivos era dar respuesta a todas las incógnitas que había detrás de la deuda externa. todo lo que había afectado a nuestro desarrollo, el haber sido exportadores de riquezas antes que haber usufructuado de un mecanismo de política como es el tomar prestado para desarrollarse.
So our object was, our goal was to give an answer to all of the things that were hidden behind the debt, all of the debt that had affected our development of being an exporting country, exporting the richness and wealth, natural resources, before having given a response to the needs of our people.
Me gustaría hacer conciencia de que esta deuda fue una carga realmente, más que un alivio. Los recursos provenientes del crédito externo y también interno definitivamente son un instrumento de política importantísimo para el desarrollo de un país. Pero cuando este instrumento es mal utilizado, entonces se vuelve una carga.
So this debt was actually, it's something that has not been at the benefit of our people. It's been a very big burden for us. I think that the international capital can be an important policy if used properly by different countries, but if it's not, it's an instrument that can be a very big burden.
Más adelante vamos a ver los números. Estas son palabras, pero más adelante vamos a ver los números que comprueban esta afirmación.
So these are just words, but in a few minutes we'll also see the numbers behind the situation that we're talking about, the actual numbers.
Adicionalmente a que fue, diríamos, mal utilizado el instrumento, las condiciones que luego recargaron el costo de este endeudamiento no hicieron sino mermar la posibilidad para desarrollar el país desde el punto de vista social y económico.
So not only was this instrument not well used, it became something that has been very difficult and has prevented in a lot of ways some of our development because of the costs associated with this debt.
Adicionalmente, el país y los países en general de nuestro sector, de nuestra región, no solamente que tuvieron mayor carga, sino que no tenían los recursos para afrontarlo. Y entonces nos vimos obligados a enfrentar una serie de procesos de renegociación. El fin último era que mientras más se pagaba, más se debía.
So additionally, other countries in our region and obviously worldwide, we found ourselves not only just heavily indebted, but the situation was that we really didn't have the resources to be able to pay back this debt. And we went through various renegotiations. We were obligated to renegotiate over and over this debt. And what we found at the end is that the more debt that we paid, the more indebted we became.
Adicionalmente del estudio que se ha realizado cuando comienza la deuda externa en 1970, bajo el gobierno de la dictadura militar, lo que hemos encontrado es que las condiciones cada vez iban haciendo más pesadas para los gobiernos como nuestro país, y definitivamente las condiciones para los acreedores cada vez eran mejores.
Additionally, we found that the beginning of this debt actually started from 1970 when we were experiencing a military dictatorship. And we found after doing this study, as a result of the study, that the conditions that we were put under for this debt became more and more difficult that we were living under, and we saw that as the debt continued to rise, that the debt conditionalities became more difficult.
Bueno, llegamos a la parte que realmente es más ilustrativa y que avaliza las palabras. Este son dos pies que muestran la estructura de la deuda.
So now we'll get to the part that I think is more illustrative actually to the numbers. So these are two pie charts that show the distribution of the debt.
En ella se puede observar que, por ejemplo, la deuda que en este momento estamos discutiendo, que es la deuda comercial, representa el 30% de la deuda pública total y sin embargo ha representado el 44% de los intereses pagados, ¿no? Esto lo convierte automáticamente en la deuda más cara.
So in these pie charts you can see that we're talking about the commercial debt, which is about 30% of the total debt owed by Ecuador, but nevertheless it represents about 44% of the total interest that's been paid, and so it therefore has become the most expensive aspect of our debt.
Obviamente para el resto de tramos es lo contrario, ¿no?
And obviously for the rest of the aspects of it, it's the opposite.
Este es un gráfico que muestra la evolución de la deuda pública desde 1981 al 2006. Y en el 81 la deuda externa pública alcanzaba 4.416 millones y para el 81 era 10.371. 4.416.
Yeah, but I have to get the factor right.
10.371.
Okay. So, this chart represents our debt from 1981 to 2006, and as you all can see on the chart, it was at the beginning about $4 billion, and it rose to 2006 in over $10 billion.
Lo sorprendente es que muy poco de este incremento luego entró al país como dinero fresco.
So what turns out as a result of our study is that very little of this money actually came into the country as new loans.
Este gráfico es un poco, podríamos ponerlo como una nueva pintura. Es un poco difícil, pero lo que trata de ver es, lo que trata de evidenciarse aquí son los distintos tramos y cómo fueron convirtiéndose en lo que hoy tenemos los bonos global y las aparentes reducciones que vamos a ver posteriormente qué pasó.
So here, this is sort of a new design way of looking at this thing. It's a little challenging to look at, but I think it's illustrative of the fact that you can see the different debt instruments that were used and the fact that there is an apparent reduction of the debt, but you can see them being converted into different instruments.
Me voy a permitir señalar una parte que es importante para identificar, ¿sí?
So I want to just point out to you this important part, and it's this red circle here that's called securitización. Esto, por ejemplo, si ustedes ven la parte azul, que era la deuda privada, comenzó a hacerse chiquita. ¿Pero por qué? Porque mediante el refinanciamiento se convirtió esta deuda en pública porque la asume el Banco Central. So you can see that this is a smaller part of the debt, and you can see that it was private debt actually that was converted, securitization, and obviously the currency is the sucre, because it was converted because it was assumed by the central bank, converted into public debt.
Bueno, en el mismo sentido, todo lo que fue, cómo fue evolucionando los distintos mecanismos hasta llegar a los bonos globales.
And you can also see how the different mechanisms were sort of evolved into finally becoming what we call the global bonds.
Esta es una tabla que explica el origen de la deuda externa comercial del país. Comienza en los años 76 hasta el 79 con la dictadura militar.
So this chart explains the evolution of the debt of the country, of the commercial debt, and it starts in 1976 during the military dictatorship.
Originalmente estos eran los llamados contratos, ¿no? Y comenzaron en la banca privada y se transformaron hacia el sector público.
So these are debts which started, I think she said, with private banks and then later became part of the public sector.
Otro de los problemas que tuvimos fue la evolución de las tasas de interés, que obviamente unilateralmente crecieron en más de 3 veces de lo que fue contratado originalmente.
Another issue we faced is that the interest rates obviously grew and they eventually became as much as 3 times what they were when the debt was originally contracted.
Y esto es lo que hace parecer una reducción de la deuda, pero que ejemplifica cómo se fueron convirtiendo o cómo fue creciendo realmente la deuda. La deuda cuando se hizo o cuando se convirtieron en los bonos, lo que hizo fue crecer en realidad, porque estos intereses en atraso, ¿no?, se convirtieron en los bonos PDI, PDI y E. En realidad lo que hubo fue un crecimiento de la deuda como tal, ¿no?
So what you can see here from this chart is the way that the debt was converted, but really it wasn't just converted, it obviously grew. And you can see that particularly this issue of the interest rates that we were behind on were converted into these Brady bonds and also PDI and IE, which, sorry, I don't know what that is.
En realidad lo que estamos viendo es que los intereses se convirtieron en capital.
So what we're seeing is that the interest rates were actually converted into hard debt.
Y estos son la conversión a los bonos global. Realmente lo que hicimos fue un prepago de estos bonos, y en realidad lo que resultó fue un nuevo crecimiento de la deuda. Adicionalmente hay que tener en cuenta, y la barra más pequeñita era el verdadero costo de la deuda en el mercado en ese momento. Es decir, no solo que lo hicimos crecer, sino que no lo compramos a un precio mucho mayor al real de mercado.
So what you can see here is that the result was that there was a lot of this debt that was kind of prepaid, and that it caused the conversion of this debt to the bonds caused actually a very large increase in our indebtedness. And the situation is even worse than that, because you have to recognize that the bonds that we purchased were at a much higher rate than they would have been had we bought these bonds just at the market rate at that time.
Y este es el cuadro que realmente evidencia que, a pesar de que somos un país pequeñito, poco desarrollado, como nos dicen, representa que resulta que nosotros hemos sido exportadores de capital.
So from this graph you can see that this chart shows the evidence that in spite of the fact that we are a country that they call small and undeveloped, that you can see that we've actually been exporters of capital.
Nótese la diferencia entre lo que recibimos y lo que realmente enviamos, 7.13 mil millones de dólares.
So you can see from this chart the difference between the inflows of capital and what we've really exported in terms of capital for a total of over $7 billion.
Y esta es una frase tomada del discurso de posesión del señor presidente de la República. El perdón y olvido a nivel social se llama impunidad, por lo que jamás olvidaremos los crímenes de los banqueros corruptos que nos quebraron, los atentados contra los derechos humanos y otros tantos delitos y atracos aún sin sancionar. Para nosotros la deuda externa no es un simple hecho, es la mayor incidencia en contra de nuestro desarrollo. Para nosotros es parte de irse en contra de nuestros derechos humanos.
So this quote, I'll just try to translate a little bit quickly, obviously from the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa. To pardon and forget at the social level is called impunity, for which we will never forget the crimes of the corrupt bankers that have broken us, and the attacks against human rights and so many other crimes that have still yet to be punished. And she closed by saying, for us, the foreign debt is not just a simple fact. It is the most grave attack on our development and on our human rights.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Creo que me sujeté, ¿no?
So thank you so much, Minister. And now we're going to have some commentary from Neal Watkins and then from Mark Weisbach. And this will be in English.
Thank you. My name is Neal Watkins. I'm the director of Jubilee USA Network. And Jubilee USA is an alliance of 75 religious denominations, faith communities, development agencies, and human rights groups here in the United States. We've been around in the United States since 1997. And we work in close partnership with Jubilee organizations and NGOs around the world, including civil society colleagues in Ecuador. And I just want to briefly give a little bit of our perspective on the debt of Ecuador today. First of all, I think as Jubilee, we have been very encouraged by the creation of the Debt Audit Commission in Ecuador. The Global Jubilee movement, one of our priorities is to generate the political will for the creation of similar initiatives in countries all across the world. And our partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have initiated citizens' debt audits. There are other efforts to encourage governments to establish audit commissions. And part of the rationale for these audit commissions, I think is important, is that it's clear that there is a lot of information to be learned from looking at the past. And especially in the current crisis and the situation we face, where nearly all of the people who are looking at the causes of the current crisis would agree that irresponsible lending has played a critical role in today's crisis, just like it did in the Third World Debt Crisis 30 years ago, which the minister spoke about in the case of Ecuador. And these audits are a way to look back at the lessons of how that lending happened and help us to avoid those mistakes in the future. So I think, just want to start by saying I think that's a very helpful initiative. Just a quick word about why as Jubilee we're concerned. One of the main reasons is of course the social cost of servicing debt. And one of the findings in the Audit Commission report, which I found most compelling, was the fact that Ecuador spent about $1.75 billion in debt service last year, which is more than the government spent on healthcare, social well-being, housing, urban development, and the environment combined. So as the financial crisis gets worse, and we're now reading headlines that this is going to impact countries, not just the United States, it's already impacting countries around the world, including Ecuador, the burden of debt will only get harder, and it's going to only impact people more. So against this backdrop, and the findings of this audit commission, let me just say a little bit about that commission. The commission itself was launched last summer. It was comprised of independent experts, many from Ecuador, many independent experts from outside of Ecuador as well. It took over a year to look at some of the history of Ecuador's debt. And they found literally hundreds of cases of irregularities, of potential illegalities, of illegitimacy of much of Ecuador's debt. This commission process has now come to a close. A report has come out. And the government is now looking at that report and making an effort to find what are some of the examples from that report that require action and attention. And we certainly welcome the fact that the government is taking seriously the findings of this very serious commission. So why are we here today? I mean, part of the I think the most important findings of the Audit Commission are allegations that some of the debts contracted have violated the Ecuadorian Constitution, Ecuadorian laws, but also general principles of international law. So our view is, regardless of what the government of Ecuador decides to do in this case, and that's obviously their sovereign decision, I think the government of Ecuador right now faces a very difficult choice, and this is a difficult choice that developing country governments all over the world must face every day. And that is take significant action, whether that's restructuring or default and risk losing access to credit, or continue to pay a dubious debt at huge social cost in the midst of a financial crisis. And I think from our point of view, Ecuador's situation belies really a more fundamental problem, and that is the lack of an independent body to which debtors can present claims of illegitimacy, illegality, or insolvency. In the United States, if we become so mired in debt, we do have something called bankruptcy. We are able to petition our creditors, and we don't have to just ask the creditors to help us. We actually have an impartial legal system which allows us to petition an impartial body to consider our situation. There is no such system in the global financial structure. And if nothing else, we certainly hope that this situation will help inspire a broader global debate about what's missing globally to help countries like Ecuador as they face these very difficult decisions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to the Minister and to Neal for the presentations. And I want to just make a couple of points on the economics because, you know, this is being reported in the business press. It's a big thing because it is a precedent-setting event, a set of events that is that the government of Ecuador is considering making these payments. There are several things that we should consider. First, it's always portrayed as a disaster for the country if something like this were to happen. And historically, this hasn't really been the case. And the most recent case of a default, the biggest sovereign debt default in the history of the world, was Argentina in 2002. And I think many people here know that they did quite well. In fact, they had only 1 quarter of decline after the default. And then they grew, had the most rapid growth practically in their history, 60% over the ensuing 5.5 years, and pulled 11, 12 million people over the poverty line. And it was a very successful experience after defaulting on their debt. And in fact, you could say the main mistake was they didn't default enough. That is, they reached an agreement with 75% of their creditors, thinking that this would allow them access to international capital markets, but it turned out that they were wrong. The holdout creditors managed to prevent them. So in other words, they kept a huge part of their debt and restructured it, and kind of for nothing, because they are now denied access to international capital markets. So in their case, it was a very important move. It was essential. I think anybody looking back now can say that default was essential to the economic recovery, the very successful economic recovery that they had. And that's not to say I'm recommending default in this case or in any case. I think every country has to look at it from their own national interest. But it's clearly the idea that all defaults or the lack of access to credit markets leads to disaster is something that is somewhat exaggerated, to say the least. Also, you got to remember, Argentina didn't just, They were denied access to international credit markets, and they also, during that first year, they had the multilateral creditors took a net $4 billion or 4% of GDP out of the country during that time. So they were still able to recover. They had this successful rapid recovery, not only without access to credit markets, but with them draining money out of the country. The second thing I want to emphasize from an economic point of view is this graph here that the minister showed. I think this is extremely important. This is something that's going on worldwide for decades now, and that is the South is a net capital exporter to the North. That is, the developing countries are exporting capital to the rich countries. And this is now this is the opposite of what we learn in Econ 101. Okay, the idea is that the rich countries are supposed to export capital to the poor countries, not just in a moral sense, but in an economic sense. They're supposed to they get a higher return, and then of course the poor countries are supposed to be able to use that capital to get an even higher return than what they have to pay the rich countries, and everybody is better off. But here we have this perverse situation where capital has been, for decades now, exported from south to north. Now, in some cases, it doesn't turn out so bad. In the case of China, one could argue whether this was the best strategy, but it worked for them, right? They've been exporting capital, running these huge trade surpluses for decades now, and still growing at 10% annually. So for them it works. But for a country that's exporting capital in this way, in other words, by just paying off more debt than they're able to borrow, in other words, just paying off more in terms of interest and capital payments than they're able to borrow, they're not benefiting from the global economy at all. And there are many countries in this situation. And if this crisis, we don't know how bad the international recession is going to be. But if it continues, I think you will see more countries reconsidering this arrangement, saying, well, why should we, the argument on the other side, of course, is, well, if they keep paying their debts on time and don't default on any payments, they'll eventually be able to reach the point where they are a net importer of capital, and then that will, under certain circumstances, contribute to the growth of their economy. That's the argument. Well, that becomes a weaker and weaker argument the longer this goes on, the longer a country ends up, a developing country, ends up supplying capital to the rich countries and not getting any development benefit out of it. Okay, so that is something, and other economists have pointed this out. Jeffrey Sachs, for example, said several years ago that the African countries, if they don't get the debt cancellation that they're asking for, they should just unilaterally cancel it themselves. And because it's very clear in their case that this is just a net loss, a lose-lose situation for them. So that's very important to consider. We have to always remember the basics. The purpose of borrowing, foreign borrowing, is to get money, resources, actual resources for the country that they wouldn't otherwise have from their domestic savings, and to use those resources to contribute to their productivity growth so that they can end up with a higher living standard. If the capital markets are not working in that manner, and this is persistent, and there's no obvious end in sight, then it does not make economic sense for a country to continue paying their debt. Finally, I just want to make a point from that relates to the current crisis, because I think this is also going to be an issue in many developing countries, and that is, and of course, in the case of Ecuador, and Ecuador is affected, I should say, even worse in some ways because the economy is dollarized, and so they don't have control over their exchange rate policy, and there are certain perverse effects of that, especially right now when the dollar has risen 20% in recent months just because of a flight to the dollar. And so that hurts them, and they can't do anything about it because they don't have their own currency. So by not being able to control exchange rate and even monetary policy, they're affected by the crisis in ways that some other countries aren't. But the truth is that almost all the developing countries are affected by this crisis. And there's a huge kind of double standard going on, okay, which everyone can see. And that is the rich, you can just go to the IMF website, where they're saying, you know, the European Central Bank should do everything, and the governments, to stimulate their economy, to make sure they counteract the results of recession. And the United States, of course, is going to run $1 trillion deficit trying to kickstart this economy. And the developing countries are being asked to do, in many cases, the opposite. And this is clearly, it's wrong even from just a purely macroeconomic perspective. But it also has a certain moral outrage to it because, especially in this case, you know, unlike the Asian crisis of 10 years ago, they clearly didn't have anything to do with creating this crisis. Their banks did not either generate or accept the bad loans that are the source of this economic crisis. They came from the United States and to a lesser extent the other rich countries. And so the idea that a country like Ecuador should force its citizens to accept hardship because of a crisis that they had nothing to do with creating, just so they can pay the debt to these banks who made the mess and who themselves are being bailed out in some cases in the United States. Even their shareholders are getting their chief executive officers and people like that are getting you know, ungodly amounts of money, or have gotten them and keeping them. This, I think, makes it even more difficult politically to accept these kinds of things. So those are the only points I wanted to make. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions if anyone wants to ask any of the minister. Elaine?
I have a question for the minister. First of all, I was wondering if you could tell us if Ecuador is one of the countries that has received debt cancellation, and if so, what were the terms, conditions? And secondly, could you tell us a little bit about the debt owed to the international financial institutions and the conditions?
Okay. La pregunta es si Ecuador ha sido uno de los países que ha recibido cancelación de su deuda y cuál es además la deuda que tiene con las instituciones financieras internacionales y las condicionalidades.
A ver, nosotros no hemos recibido cancelaciones de deuda. Han habido situaciones con países, con otros países, de canje de deuda. Canje.
Swap.
Oh, okay, thank you. So, no, Ecuador has not received debt cancellation. What they have received is debt swaps.
That's just a restructuring.
Okay.
La segunda pregunta era con respecto a los multilaterales. ¿Cuál es el valor en este momento? Es más o menos un tercio en cada caso. Estamos hablando de algo así como alrededor de 3.000 millones, ¿no? Las condiciones de los multilaterales, bueno, esperamos que sean las mismas que ocurren en todos los países, y hasta aquí no hemos notado que hayan ninguna variación, ¿no?
The debt that they have with the international financial institutions is about $3 billion, and the conditionalities are, you know, pretty much the same as you would see in any other country. So far, they haven't seen any variation.
Now that they've done an analysis of the conditions and the way that the debt has been incurred, do they have a sense of how they're going to move forward in terms of what policy steps they're going to take in relation to the different kinds of debt that they currently hold?
Ahora que han hecho el análisis de las condicionalidades y la deuda y cómo se formó, Ahora sería interesante saber si saben ahora las políticas que van a tomar resultados de la información.
Nosotros hemos comentado que hemos contratado, sobre todo la parte legal, ¿no? Hemos contratado a abogados para que estudien la posibilidad de si existe o no existe un caso en las leyes que corresponden, que son las leyes del Estado de Nueva York, ¿no? Eso por un lado. Segundo, evidentemente tenemos poco tiempo con respecto a una fecha que ya se nos viene encima, pero nuestra posición es la de investigar todas las posibilidades que tengamos y la decisión final va a ser tomada por el señor Presidente de la República, obviamente con el apoyo de todo su equipo.
So we have a contract actually with a group of lawyers that are going to be evaluating what we should do with the debt in relation to the place where they were contracted, which is in the bond markets of New York. And so we're evaluating that right now. But we have very little time because there's this date that's upon us, as we know, the 15th. And so our position so far has been to investigate all of our options, and the final decisions will be taken by the President of the Republic, obviously with all of the support of his team that's been working on this. Actually, I'm really sorry, but I think that the minister has to go. She has another commitment, or do we have time for one more question? One more question. Okay, go ahead.
¿Puedo hablar en español? Sí, cuando el gobierno está estudiando las alternativas para lo que es mejor para el gobierno de Ecuador, aparte de la reestructura de Argentina, ¿está usted considerando otros ejemplos de otros países que posiblemente han sido más exitosos en tener una reestructura? Me viene a la mente, por ejemplo, Nicaragua, que tuvo un programa de recompra de la deuda con una participación altísima, mayor a la Argentina, que la Argentina fue de 36%, pero Nicaragua fue 99%.
So the question was if in looking at alternatives and the restructuring of the debt, if there are other examples besides the case of Argentina that they were also looking at, and he's posing the example of Nicaragua because he said that the restructuring that Argentina offered was only taken up by 76% of the bondholders, whereas in Nicaragua they had a higher rate of participation, about 99%.
Nosotros hemos considerado todas las opciones, todas, absolutamente todas. Nosotros no nos limitamos a uno o dos elementos. Hemos tratado de conseguir todas las posibilidades. Lamentablemente el estudio es muy, digamos, hay mucho que estudiar, ¿no? Y el tiempo que tenemos es corto, ¿no? Pero en todo caso, mire, todas las posibilidades han sido tomadas en cuenta, así como la particularidad del país, que yo creo que es importante porque de alguna manera no estamos en la misma situación, el entorno es distinto y las condiciones del país también son distintas, ¿no? Mire lo curioso, comenzamos el estudio hace un año, resulta que un año después, cuando tenemos las respuestas, el mundo está en crisis, esta economía está en crisis y nosotros, que éramos evaluados con menos B, triple C y todo lo demás, resulta que estamos vivos. Y los triple A, ¿dónde están?
So absolutely, we are studying all of the different options and examples and past history that we can. We're certainly not limiting ourselves to any particular elements. Unfortunately, there's just so much to study and not that much time. But we are considering all of the options and possibilities and also things related to the specifics of our country. Obviously, we're in a different moment, a different kind of political scenario than when any other country entered or faced a similar situation. We also have particular unique things about our country, obviously, and our situation. I mean, just to give you an example, look at 1 year later when we started the study. A year ago, now a year later, the world is in this huge crisis, and there's this global economic crisis, and we who are rated, B- or triple C, we're doing fine, and here are all the triple A countries are the ones that are facing crisis. So with that, I really apologize, but I wanted to thank actually Ambassador Gallegos from Ecuador and his staff for their collaboration in putting on this event. I'd especially like to thank Minister Viteri for her time in explaining this situation to us. I know that Neal from Jubilee, Mark, and myself will be obviously continuing to follow this, as I'm sure many of you are. And I thank you all for coming on such short notice. And I think Neal wants to make a quick final point, if you'll just wait one more second.
Yeah, just a quick point on behalf of Jubilee USA. Thank you as well. We've just launched an initiative to show our support for the audit process in Ecuador and to raise awareness about the conditions of debt service payment in Ecuador. There's a sign-on letter which we're circulating for non-governmental organizations that would like to offer support to the U.S. Congress to raise awareness about the situation of Ecuador's debt. I'm going to pass these around if you are an NGO and you'd be able to join us by signing on to this letter. There's information on here about how you can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Solamente algo adicional. En primer lugar, thank you very much. Lamento, yo soy muy alérgica, lamento el llanto de algún momentito, pero la garganta me mata. Y segundo, que aquí les traigo unos pocos ejemplares de lo que es el resumen ejecutivo, pero que puede ser tomado desde la página web del Ministerio. Entonces los dejo para que sea.
So she just wanted to make a final comment to say thank you all for coming and for your interest in this situation. And she actually has a couple of copies of the executive summary of the Commission's report, if a few people would be interested in taking it. But you can also get a copy of it on the Ministry's website, and we're happy to share that link with you in a subsequent email. Thank you very much.